Welcome to Beyond the Crisis, a series of conversations around what the future might look like when we get back to normal, whatever that looks like. And most importantly, how can we use this crisis to accelerate the progress we're trying to make in life, whether that's our personal life, at work, or with our money as well. So today I'm joined by Brian Portnoy. Brian is an author, he's a speaker, he's a financial educator, he's a father of three, and from what I know, an all-around good guy. So Brian, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for being here today. So Brian's the author of a couple books. He's the author of The Investor's Paradox, which he wrote a few years back, and then Geometry of Wealth, which I have a copy of here. I highly recommend it. And today we're going to be spending most of our time on the Geometry of Wealth. Brian, The Investor's Paradox, I think, is largely about how to make better investment decisions, the tactics that go along with that. Whereas the Geometry of Wealth, as the subtitle goes, is how to use money to shape a life of meaning. I was interested to hear you say that you wrote the wrong book first. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you say that?
Yeah, thanks. And it's good to see you and to be able to chat with you. I joke that I wrote the wrong book first because the way I've come to understand a healthy relationship with money does not start with the most visible pieces, the investing, the stocks, the bonds, turning on CNBC. I mean, those topics, interesting, sometimes gets our heart racing a little bit. But I've come to really see investing as sort of the end of the process of our money life. What comes well before that, in my view, is, as you allude to, the how, but more importantly, the why. Sort of what is it that we're trying to do with our lives? Where does money fit into that? And it's a pretty big topic for people to explore, either in their own head, with their partner, with their parents, with their kids, however they want to go about doing it. And so the Geometry of Wealth was published 4+ years after The Investor's Paradox, because I wanted to take a step, much further back, not just as a writer, an educator, an investor, but also as a father, as a husband, as a son, and really think about where money fits into a meaningful life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the concepts that really stuck with me in the book was the difference between being rich and being wealthy. And I think that's, when you unpack that, as you did in the book, that's a really powerful concept. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a semantic set of issues that I think are pretty important to put up front so that we know what we're talking about, so that we're on the same page. And this is the distinction I make. To me, being rich is having more money, plain and simple, or the things that money might buy. And so the more money you have, the richer you are. But one thing we know from a lot of different disciplines, but especially psychology, but increasingly in neuroscience, is that this quest for more is not particularly satisfying. It might feel good in the here and now to get that promotion, to see the size of your bank account increase, to have a stock in your portfolio go up. But that happiness that you get from achieving those goals tends to be relatively short-lived. And so I distinguish between being rich and, on the other hand, being wealthy. And I have a pretty precise definition of wealthy, which is the ability to underwrite a meaningful life, which is a loaded term and phrase, and we can unpack that. But my shorthand for being wealthy is funded contentment. It's the idea that life has various sources of contentment and joy, and we want to think about those first. But then after we've done that and given some consideration to what the good life is all about, we can then bring money into the conversation. So quest for more, not terribly satisfying from everything we know. The quest for funded contentment can be incredibly satisfying.
Yeah. You alluded to this earlier with, CNBC and chasing the hot stock, and, all that stuff is exciting. I think humans are wired to pay attention to the stuff that's right in front of our face and not necessarily pay attention to some of this stuff that will make us happy down the road that the research says we should be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've spent a fair amount of time thinking about that piece of the equation.
Yeah.
Just can you set the table a little bit for how difficult this is, and I guess maybe how important is it to be intentional about thinking about what we're actually trying to do with our money, because the deck is really stacked against us.
I think, well, it is. And, so I'll start off by saying that my very least favorite word in all of economics and finance is irrational. So, you'll see economists and other scolds on TV talk about sort of, irrational behavior or dumb money decisions. And yes, we can certainly make mistakes, but the big challenge that we need to understand, and why everybody is on really the same side of the ledger here, is that our brains were wired to make pretty lousy decisions about money. So, I mean, the story starts literally more than 100,000 years ago, when the brain that we have in our head right now is more or less the brain that we have right now. And the survival instincts that we've developed over these millennia, that's really what drives us. So survival is the name of the game. We have a fight or flight mentality or instinct that's very precisely honed. We know in an instant if there's sort of danger around us. Well, you port that into making decisions about money. You port that into taking the long view instead of focusing on the here and now. It's really hard. So one thing I like to spend a fair amount of time with clients going over is the fact that we're not irrational. What we are is human. What we are is normal. And all of the basic rules of finance, like buy low, sell high, invest for the long run, have a diversified portfolio, save more, spend less. The deck is stacked against us, because our brains were wired to do the opposite of all of those quote unquote common sense pieces of advice.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a great line in your book that I highlighted here, and it says, money and happiness, both are fictions in the sense that they don't exist in nature. So the question is, right, if all of this is true, and we need to make decisions that are in our best long-term interest, I guess the first question would be, can money buy happiness? If not, what's the point of doing all this, right?
Right. Well, that's a small question. My sort of joking but serious answer to the question of whether money buys happiness is not really, but kind of yes. It depends on a few different things, and in particular how we think about happiness. And there are so many different definitions of that. And depending on whether you're an economist or a psychologist or just a normal person trying to get through the day, happiness comes in a lot of different flavors. I like to make the distinction between what I call experienced happiness and reflective happiness. And so experienced happiness is just sort of a day-to-day good mood, bad mood. You roll out of bed and you're sort of happy or sad, sort of a pain versus pleasure type spectrum, very here and now. Reflective happiness is more of the step back and you wonder, am I living my best life? Are things going as I would hope? What do I really want to achieve? And because the latter is effortful and intentional and taxes our brain from a thinking capacity, we tend not to sit around all day, every day thinking about the good life. I mean, we're not all just Greek philosophers. We want to get on with our day and have a good time and all that. As it relates to money and happiness, experienced happiness, money doesn't do much beyond a middle class income. So when you go from 100 grand to $1 million to $10 million a year in income, there is plenty of research to suggest that your day-to-day happiness isn't driven by your income or size of your portfolio, because we sort of have, each of us, our own distinct level set personality. Some of us are more cheerful. Some of us are a little bit gloomier. We are who we are. And you can get off type a little bit, but we tend to revert to that, whoever we are, relatively quickly, and the amount of money in your bank account doesn't make any difference. It's a little bit more complicated when we think about the relationship between money and a meaningful life, and there's some evidence to show that depending on how we think about things, depending on how we frame the good life, then we can be very intentional, very deliberate about deploying money in a way that really helps us move forward along those scales in terms of what really matters.
Yeah. So maybe let's get into that a little bit. Yeah. So these things that we can control, right? Everybody's going to have wiring that predisposes them to be, happy or maybe less happy. Kind of like the introvert extrovert scale, right? We're all going to be somewhere on that spectrum, and we can't necessarily do anything about it. But I think you were saying there is a piece of it that we can do something about, that we can be intentional about, that we can use money in a way that shapes a life of meaning. So can you get into a little bit of how we might do that, or what are some of those different areas that we can think about?
Yeah. So the simple mental model that I have developed that I think, or I hope, illuminates sort of the sources of a meaningful life has 4 components. It's what I call the 4 C's.
Okay.
Connection, control, competence, and context. And let me kind of touch on each of those because I think they'll resonate with people in their day-to-day lives. So the first really deep source of meaning, and I would rank it number 1 from what we understand, is connection. We are social animals. That need to belong, that membership in a tribe, small t tribe, is sort of just definitional of who we are. It's not that we just enjoy each other's company. It's much more deep-rooted from a biological or even from a genetic perspective, that we just need to be around others. And so, one of the things with, surviving this crisis that hopefully we're, making our way through is that we've been isolated from each other. And that can be really difficult. So the second source of deep contentment is control or autonomy. There's a reason why we value liberty, freedom, that ability to set your own course, achieving goals. It's just part of who we are. You want to move forward, you want to grow, and you want to sort of do your own thing, and you don't want to be told what to do. Very, very important to have that sense of control over your own life. And when we don't have control, it really does beat us down. The third dimension is competence, which is really kind of our work identity. When you go to a party and you meet somebody, not that any of us have really been to a party for a while, but
the good old days.
Yeah, good old days. When you meet somebody, they'll often say, "Oh, what do you do?" Well, here's a little secret. They don't care what you do. They care who you are. They care what your identity is. They want to get a sense of what's really important to you. And we all know that whether we define it as our job, our vocation, but even our hobbies, those are kind of part of our identity. And when we have a job we like, we feel better. When feel like we're out of sorts and aren't on the right career path, or are out of work, we don't feel as good about things. So work and identity, what I call competence, really important. And then lastly, the biggest picture topic, but I'll just make it quick, is this idea of context. We know that people who have an attachment to something beyond themselves, who live for reasons outside of their own ego, tend to lead more fulfilling lives. And what are the sources of that? Religion and faith is the obvious one to mention, but it's also your sense of place, whether it be your town, your nation, your region. We have that sense of patriotism, if you will. But it could even be other attachments like, your sports teams, which sounds maybe trivial, but we think about the passion we bring to bear. I've got 3 kids, and I think about their, passion for sports and the teams that they follow. It becomes, sort of part of who you are. So just, to put a bow around that, 4 sources of contentment. They sort of bleed into each other in some different ways. There are some complexities, but I think if we as human beings, as members of a tribe, small t tribe, in our community, however we define that, if we can think through those deeper sources of contentment and then think about, well, what does it cost to afford those things? You can actually have a productive, constructive thought process about connecting money and meaning.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So let me make sure I got it here. We got connection, we have control, we have competency, and we have context.
Mm-hmm.
So the four C's, and you make the case that is actually how we can live a meaningful life. This notion of being wealthy is paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to those four things. Can you talk a little bit about how somebody, okay, so say they buy into this, yes, those are the four C's. Yes, I need to pay more attention to those and actually use my wealth, align my wealth to support those things, or move myself in the direction in each of those areas that I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to go.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, I know the geometry of wealth, you have your three different shapes, right? It's basically a process for taking this and getting it down to the tactics of actually making an investment decision. Your first one is purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that's where the four C's kind of tie into, right? Is the purpose section. Can you talk a little bit about how somebody might take that first step? Okay, I got the four C's. I'm going to think about them. Okay, how do I actually put that into practice?
Yeah. So it's great. So the three steps are simply put: defining purpose, setting priorities, and making decisions. The setting purpose piece, and the reason the shape for that one is a circle, is that, as my dad, has said many times over the years, it's a round world. Things, we're always figuring stuff out. Who we are in our middle age isn't who we are as kids, and probably isn't who we're going to be when we're much older in life. We're always figuring that out. So this is a more introspective step in terms of giving consideration to those four C's, and recognizing that it's not always clear and that it's going to change over time, but it's useful, even healthy, to come to grips at any moment in time with what you believe to be really important to you. That's step one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so we take that, so we get clear on if it's connections, right? Who we want to be connected with, what that looks like. If the kids are across the country, right? Maybe it's being very intentional. We want to travel and see them 3 times a year, and we want to put that into the budget. I mean, is that what you're talking about at this level? Is look at each of those C's, define what that means to us, and then start to incorporate that into our spending, our plans, things like that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the nice thing, I think, about the framework, which is that you can take this, what could be pie in the sky type consideration of the good life, but it quickly becomes very practical. And, let's say your kids have moved away, you have grandkids, they live elsewhere. For most people, I think obviously that's going to be a very high priority. And most of us don't have enough money where you can afford everything at all times. So, this is where we begin to make trade-offs, to set priorities. And so generally we want to align or calibrate purpose and planning, sort of the big picture stuff with the very practical stuff. And so once you've thought about what's really driving your happiness or your more meaningful life, then we get into a prioritization where we're managing risk on the one hand, and then reaching for great stuff on the other. And one of the points I do like to make to people is that it's a lot easier to think about reaching for the upside than managing the downside. But the best investors in the world, and I think some of the more thoughtful, people that I've come across in the world of money, they're quite good. They're quite intuitive of putting that risk first hat on. I call it being less wrong. I think especially as Americans, we want to be better, faster, smarter, richer. A lot, we want to, we want to win, we want to compete. But before we get there, I think it's critical to think about, well, what might go wrong, and how do I hedge against that? And this isn't insurance in the narrowest of sense. Yes, it makes sense to buy fire insurance for your home, and most of us aren't upset if that is quote unquote wasted money, because it means that your house didn't burn down and you didn't need to get reimbursed from the insurance company. But if you think more broadly about what can go wrong in our relationships, in our career, in our broader sense of purpose, there are ways to sort of invert your risk management process to really think through that. So this way we begin to connect the philosophical with the practical.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, purpose is the first step, priorities, which you've started to touch on a little bit, being the second step, where we can't do, most people don't have unlimited wealth, right? They're going to have to take this broad broad set of options and start to narrow it down into priorities. And then lastly, we get down to the tactics step. Can you maybe give us a little bit of an example around tactics? I mean, you mentioned winning the right game, which is the same concept that you've alluded to before. What that looks like. Most people, again, back to initially talking about CNBC and the things that are exciting to pay attention to, that might not be the right game for somebody, right? And so when you get down to tactics, there's so many different things you could invest in, so many different things you could pursue. How do you use this framework, I guess, to narrow the playing field to what really matters for you, and then so that you can make sure to win the right game?
Yeah. Okay. So let's try to dive in a little bit. We could talk about this for hours. First of all, we have to recognize that money life, what I call money life, has many different dimensions. Investing is one of them, but we have earning, saving, spending, insuring, giving, borrowing, and so forth. So we often, especially in a financial advice context, both the advisor and the client tend to focus on the portfolio, tend to focus on the market first and foremost. And I would argue, in the same way that my books were written in the wrong order, that we want to make sure that investing piece kind of comes toward the end, once we've understood what it is we're actually trying to underwrite or fund. When we actually get to the investment decision piece, out of all the different money dimensions, just focus on investing. I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I think success in investing boils down to setting and managing expectations. It's not about finding the next Netflix or Amazon. It's great if you do, and it's probably going to be more luck than skill if you buy that tiny company that becomes the next big thing. It's not about finding the hot fund manager who's smarter than everybody else. It's really about calibrating the needs for your portfolio with what you've already established as your purpose and your priorities. And so, it's both easy to say and hard to execute that the return expectations that we have for our portfolio, the amount of volatility we're able to withstand along the way, how all of the different stocks and bonds and funds and different opportunities fit together. There are layers of expectation setting that go into there. And I think the people who have the healthier relationships with money, as far as I've seen from either side of the table, from the advisor's side of the table or the client side of the table, have done a really nice job at simplifying and clarifying what those expectations are. Because if your expectation is that, well, I think based on my own biased view of history that the market can make me 15 to 20% a year for the next 20 years, you've really mismanaged expectations. At the same time, if you think the world's going to fall apart and I basically want to hide in a bunker and I'm not going to be able to make more than 1 or 2% a year and I'm not going to take any risk, well, that's the same extreme mistake, just on the other side of the ledger. So it's really important for individuals or for those working with advisors to take the time to manage expectations in a way that kind of maps up to what history has taught us and play the odds. We're not very good at playing the odds. What we are good at is saying, I think that the Fed is going to do this. You know, they're going to, you know, tighten or relax the money supply. I think that Tesla is going to go up or down. I think the price of oil is going to be $10 or $100 a barrel. Like we kind of not only enjoy that, we're sort of wired to make those point predictions. What we're not wired to do is to think statistically, to think in terms of probabilities and ranges. But the very best investors, and I've had the privilege of meeting some of them over the years, all over the world, they're quite good at stepping back and calmly saying, okay, here's the range of what could go good or bad, and I'm going to assign some probabilities to those, and then we're going to see what happens. And recognize that, you know, sometimes a bad outcome isn't the same as a mistake. Sometimes it just didn't go as well as you hoped, but the way it went kind of was in your range of expectations. Really important to get that on the table.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think it's a good place to start to wind down here. I mean, we're always talking to clients about maximizing the probability that they can achieve their goals. You know, that's the lens in which we look at it. How do we tip the odds in our favor? And that's sometimes, you know, the best we can do. We can't predict the future. Nobody can, but we can maximize the probability that we're going to get where we're trying to go. So appreciate that. So I got one final closing question for you, but really appreciated your time today. I think you did a great job of kind of breaking down some of the science, some of the research, and kind of simplify these concepts around money and meaning. So appreciate your time. Again, I'll say if anybody wants to dive in deeper, check out Brian's book. It's really excellent. So I'd highly recommend that. So last question here, given that this is a series about beyond the crisis, my final question for you is, what, if anything, will you change about your life going forward? Either something that you have realized you can completely cut out of your life, something that you desperately wish and can't wait to get back to. What are you going to change after all this we've been through in 2020 so far?
I'll point to two things quickly. One is just on the family front, because we've been at home for 3 months now. Family dinners have been great. I'm not sure if our kids enjoy them as much as my wife and I do. But we're going to try really hard to maintain that tradition. It won't be 7 nights a week, I'm sure. But, you know, we've got 3 teenage kids at home, and within a couple years, 2 of them are going to be off to college. So I think this whole episode has thrown into relief what enjoyment we get from our family. And so we're going to try to cherish that as much as possible. And then the second thing is, and I think you know this, you know, my career has evolved in a variety of ways. I recently launched my own business. It wasn't because of the crisis, but as an entrepreneur, I now have, I think, a slightly more refined or different sense of risk-taking than I did even a few months ago. And I want to take some of the opportunity to think about those risks in a different context and put them into play in my business.
Yeah, well, that's great. That sounds like connection and control right there. 2 of the 4 C's. So
there you go.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brian. It's been great, and I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.